koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. No mai, haere mai, Tracey, welcome to you all. Ko Louise Humpage taku ingoa. So I'm Louise Humpage, the current discipline convener of gender studies, and it's with great pleasure that I've organised this event with, now can I find them in the audience? There's Liz Hosking somewhere at the back, yes. Oh, and Anne-Marie Parsons from Campus Life. We did a much longer introduction the other day for the first lecture. Today we're much more compressed in time, so I'm going to whiz you through this, which is that if you look at the back as you leave on a chair, there's some of these leaflets. If you haven't already seen the full list of the 6 winter lecture series lectures, you can see what else is to come. And very soon there will also be the recording from the last lecture, and all of the recordings will go up within a few days of each lecture. Now, of course, gender intersects with a range of other identities, and we know that gender impacts and shapes our experiences in different ways for different communities. So our 6 lectures can only just begin to start to kind of tap into the range of different experiences that we might want to explore. So I encourage you, Liz, have you got the circulation sheet that's going around? Partly that's for contact tracing if we need it, but it's also if you would like to be on the Gender Studies newsletter email list that goes out every week with events around gender issues, jobs and funding and all sorts of things, please put your name down and you can hear about other events that may address some of the issues that we just can't deal with in terms of this series. So without further ado, it is with particular pleasure that I get to introduce Professor Tracey McIntosh, Ngāi Tūhoi, Professor of Indigenous Studies, Co-Director of Te Wānanga or Waipapa, so our Māori and Pacific Studies, because she used to have the office next door to mine. So she's actually a sociologist, and a wonderful sociologist who has not only done the kind of theoretical and the kind of, academic work, but has engaged with government in particular around issues for Māori in a number of ways. So I'm not going to waste your time by doing too many lists, but the one list that I wanted to highlight was that in recent years, Tracey has been on, and it is quite a long list, so that's a colon with some semicolons coming. The Expert Advisory Group on Solutions to Child Poverty, Welfare Expert Advisory Group, the Safe and Effective Justice Advisory Group, the Cannabis Expert Panel, and currently she is Chief Science Advisor for the Ministry of Social Development. Her research focuses on religion, systematic suffering, state crime and marginalisation and identity issues for Māori, and it's particularly issues relating to Wāhine Māori in prison that Tracey is going to speak today.
Mauri ora ki a koutou, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Ko waio, ko mātātua te waka, ko tūhoi te iwi, ko Ngāti Kaura te hapu, ko tunuku te marae, ko Tracey McIntosh aho. It's just really lovely to be here. I've taught quite a bit in this little room. It's sort of the private, intimate, where is it type of room. So it's lovely to be here. Now we will be moving very quickly out of this room. So just for people to be aware of that. And I want to really start with some acknowledgements, and they could be very, very broad. And I just sort of thought, if I'm going to do some acknowledgements, who would I do within thinking? And firstly, I just want to acknowledge Moana Jackson. And, Moana, when he started this work, there were so few who were working alongside them, and just really recognising Moana. Many of you know that Moana is not well, and so just sort of reflecting and thinking about him, the korowai that we wrap around Moana during this time of his illness. Also thinking about people who were working alongside and still do, Annette Sykes and others who worked alongside and remain really staunch in regards to it. Kim Workman, again, that we have got now sort of the kaumātua who have worked in this area. I really want in terms of this talk to recognise Maya Kursic. Maya's return back to Slovenia. She's a PhD student, finished, completed, submitted, didn't get it conferred because of COVID, but who has really looked at Māori and hyper-incarceration, and that I'll be drawing on some of her work during this. I wanted to really lift up the work and the words of incarcerated women who have informed all of the work that I have done, particularly thinking of Tricia Walsh, Te Atawhai Neira Te Rangi. And those are those that I can name. For a whole range of reasons, others cannot be named, but I really want to recognise their work and the way that they have given so generously to me now for well over 12, going on to 15 years, the generosity that they continue to give me in terms of their work, recognising the many women that are at the moment incarcerated who continue to inform the work and give me these insights that I can give to you as a koha. I'd like to recognise the other Māori researchers, particularly working in this area, and the activists in this area. Lily George, Julia Whaiputi, Rebecca Winihana, Cheryl Smith, Helena Ratreyas, Kylie Quince, from our own, within here, with Rob Webb, with Alice Mills, with others working it. Our wonderful, irrepressible Julia Whaiputi. We've gone on a few hikois, what we call apology hikois, but there's the incredible sort of strength and power of her work. And to many of my own students who continue to give me so much insight and give me incredible confidence that the work that we do, they think about things in ways that I haven't been able to think about. They have a reach that I will not have, and I recognise that. And Emily Rakati, Grace Gordon, Jessica Lim, Freya Anderson, Tila Moose, Max Whitehurst, and also those students who are just starting to work in this area, and undergraduate students. Many a long list, and as I said, it gives great, great confidence to think about those that will come, who will do this really important work going forward. And I wanted to start with something that Dr. Leela Watson, an Aboriginal activist, said right back in the 70s. If you come here to help me, then you're wasting your time. But if your liberation is tied to mine, then come, let us work together. So I'm going to start with a poem. Usually I draw on the poems of the creative writing that I do within the prison, but actually the poems today I think are actually all of mine, and it's more just a sort of, they're not as good as actually as the poems that I get from the women who are inside, but they speak to some of the analytical frames that I want us to consider over the next minutes that we have together. And this one is called Our Incarceration. Is it the dark of me laid across generations? Is it the name of me passed through complex histories? Is it the loss of me wrought by those with manifest destiny? Is it the shame of me created by their acts of tyranny? To sit in these confines, a cell amongst other cells, within the abject lie that being a prisoner is the nature of me. This poem questions why Wāhine Māori are disproportionately incarcerated in the prison system of New Zealand. It asks whether the answer to understanding collective incarceration can be found in responses to colonial, state, and popular racist discourses, or in the intergenerational transfer of inequalities through dual processes of deprivation and discrimination. It queries the state processes that seek to render whakapapa and cultural links as deviant through removal, dismissal, dislocation, and alienation from our resources, and distancing us from our language, our rituals, and our cultural practices. It interrogates the power relations and processes of oppression that are part of the neo-colonial project. Finally, it concludes with the lie that prison is an inevitable outcome, and indeed the destiny of certain groups, and a recognition that the lie has become normalised and naturalised. It illustrates the necessity of knowing why we are where we are. What are the trajectories that lead to lives of privilege or to the lives of profound precarity? The Māori experience of colonisation is paralleled by struggles of Indigenous peoples in other settler states which have also been systemically brutalised and marginalised by state policies and practices, and where they continue to be overrepresented in prison populations. The settler states have sought to control Indigenous lives and to dispossess them of all resources in what Caneen and Porter have called a process of immiseration. Moana Jackson recognises that neo-colonising powers do not take challenges to the authority lightly. He asserts that those who take power unjustly defend it with injustice. Jackson speaks of the settler states having a history of misremembering and misnaming. He claims that even the term settler is problematic, as it misrepresents the reality of dispossession. Prisons, then, are sites of both forgetting and the legitimation of the rights of the settler state. Dispossession. Then the dispossessed disappear behind the wire, concentrated as one blemished body, where the truth of that dispossession is destroyed, till only the crim remains. Māori women in prison are a socially submerged population. Moreover, the disproportionality of Māori in the criminal justice system is particularly pronounced for Māori women, who are even more represented than Māori men in apprehensions, convictions, and imprisonment. These women come out of communities where they are members of whānau, have iwi and hapu connections, and have intimate and complex ties that link them to places, to histories, and to people. They are likely to experience multiple forms of social harm, and many have gone on to perpetrate social harm on others. Moreover, their experience and knowledge of incarceration usually significantly predates their own confinement. We cannot and should not understand incarcerated and criminalised women only through the lens of victimhood. And that is something, I'm not going to be able to talk about that in length, but it is a really important element. If we persist on relying on notions of victim and offender to understand Wāhine Māori in prison, this means relying on identities offered by the criminal justice system. Without a doubt, victimisation rates for both incarcerated men and women are far higher than for the general population. Women who are incarcerated have experienced violence, including sexual violence, from the youngest of ages, in some cases from infanthood. Yet, just as we are more than the worst things that we've ever done, there is also more than the worst thing that has ever happened to us. We are not just suffering. As Una Barr notes, seeing women as offenders, victims, or survivors links their identity often to another person, often to male, or to a traumatic or harmful event. These are important to note these relationships, to notice these connections. However, it's important to also consider women as, and here I'm quoting her, brickholders of their own resistance, resisting the structures which constrain their identities. This calls on us to acknowledge the harms our systems inflict and to create the kind of social and economic conditions that allow us to make choices under conditions of our own choosing. To have a just justice system, we must have a just society. Miriama Kaba and Kelly Hayes note that prisons confine people, but they do not confine or eradicate, indeed they reproduce, the conditions that facilitate harms or the mentalities that perpetrate violence. They argue for a jailbreak of the imagination by seeing and understanding prisons for what they are and demanding the transformation of systems that perpetuate violence. Here I'm drawing on the words of Tricia Walsh. Tricia is an astonishing woman who's spent significant amounts of her time in prison. And again, she gives this as a koha to you all. Prisons did not rehabilitate me. I remember my first time in prison. I was all of 16 years of age when I was sentenced to 3 months of corrective training. I left behind a 7-month-old baby who was left in the care of my alcoholic mother and my 11-year-old sister. I remember arriving at Arahata in a police car and being left in the bus stop. The bus stop is actually the waiting cubicle. It's always called the bus stop. For what seemed like hours, I was given a mug of barley soup and a stale sandwich, both of which I scoffed down. As the other prisoners walked past, tapping on the windows, some of them making intimidating remarks, I felt my bravado begin to diminish, and a feeling of vulnerability, a feeling that was so intimate to me, overcame me. I wasn't so tough sitting in that bus stop. I heard the jingle of keys and was led to a room to be processed. Prison did not rehabilitate me. I would return again, all for cannabis offences, feeding a greater addiction and unsuccessfully masking the deep mamai. Prison did not rehabilitate me, and after the first time I navigated it with ease. Whakapapa and the restoration of mana rehabilitated me. Redress in response to harm must capture the entirety of the context in which something harmful occurs, and reflecting on physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, family, and whānau violence, we must ensure that we address and seek to redress colonial, state, colonial, neo-colonial, legislative, structural, political, economic, cultural, religious, institutional, and collective violence. The latter are forms of systemic violence that often provide the context for the former. Legislative violence, for example, has both historical and contemporary cases where they impact on Indigenous peoples and the present economic impoverishment is marked. The colonial state uses legislative powers to alienate land and to punish, often by incarceration and other forms of detention, those original owners that sought to defend their lands, to protect their lands and their resources. Legislation has allowed the legal removal of children from their families, and too often has also attempted to remove their culture and their identity. Violence is nuanced and can be both explosive and incremental. Climate change can be seen as this exemplar, drawing on Rob Nixon's work, of slow violence, but can also be useful in understanding the impact and violence of poverty, the violence of incarceration, the violence of social harm. Systemic violence is often the locus of trauma and the precedent to economic deprivation that spans generations. Systemic suffering comes from a deliberate, organised, methodological, planned delivery of processes that generate human and environmental suffering. The dispossession of land in one century creates the conditions for systemic racialised injustice in the next. Shannon Speed, an Indigenous scholar in the US, and drawing on the experiences of incarcerated Indigenous migrant women in the United States, has argued powerfully that while interpersonal violence, criminal violence, and state violence are often understood as distinct dynamics, in fact, and I'm quoting her here, these forms of violence are inseparable, each bound to the other and mutually formative in the larger context in which they affect women's lives. If we are to reimagine justice, then we must know our past and where that past intrudes into our present and intrudes into our future. And in understanding why we are where we are, we have to understand that different trajectories produce different outcomes. Cumulative privilege and cumulative disadvantage are likely to inform life's chances across generations. It is critical that our understanding of the present condition is informed by those who have experienced incarceration, having been incarcerated, whānau of those who have been incarcerated, or by those who work with and support those who have been incarcerated. So this is really about lived experience as expert knowledge. So I draw on the knowledge of Wāhine Māori, their experiences and insight to identify and explicate complex social issues and enable greater understanding and more informed solutions. They recognise that this experience of removal, of dismissal, of disconnection and deprivation is both individual and a collective experience. They weave their insider knowledge into the fabric of our injustice system. It is clear that Wāhine Māori with personal experience can, once appropriately resourced and supported, devise innovative Māori-centred solutions. Privileging their insider status means that we're able to go beyond merely describing the prison world, but move towards new creative possibilities in the art of decarceration and create new possibilities for transformative change, of intergenerational change, of mokapunatanga, for whānau and for communities. It is clear that they have first-hand experience of the many dimensions of violence, and they bring this expertise to the discussion. And here I'm drawing particularly in this part on Amaya's work around the violence continuum. So violence is one of the dominant characteristics of all forms of colonisation. Its shape and scale may differ, but it has always been the intimate companion of colonisation since the systemic inception into the perilous substance of the capitalist world system. Nancy Shepherd-Hughes and Philip Bourgois define violence as non-linear, productive, destructive, and reproductive. Violence gives birth to itself, so we can rightly speak of chains, spirals, and mirrors of violence, or as we prefer, a continuum of violence. For example, there is a recognition that someone who has suffered violence as a child and adolescent may be more inclined to draw on violence as a tool when experiencing frustration or interpersonal conflict. They are also more likely to use it to attempt to control or dominate others. And it can be violence and used in this way can be a very rational expression in terms of the environment that you live in. Violence creates the conditions to generate more violence, both on a micro, everyday, individual, or small group interactions, and within macro-structural levels. As an intentional exercise of force of power, violence perpetrates pain through either physical force, psychological manipulation, social violence, or political oppression. And I've sort of given examples for all of those, but I've left those out. The latter includes various forms of structural and symbolic violence that are allowed to express themselves in social institutions, including the criminal justice system. Structural violence can be identified through practices that embed poverty for Indigenous peoples and systemic colonisation via this dispossession of land and removal of the Indigenous economic base, culture and livelihood, together with the generation of sites of confinement, such as youth homes, hostels, native schools, and systemic deprivation of basic human rights. Symbolic violence, on the other hand, appears as the result of systemic to the degree where violence becomes misrecognised, taken for granted, and seen as something normal rather than as a form of violence and domination. They're particularly talking about state forms of violence and structural forms of violence. Consequently, this subtle violence becomes invisible, even to its victims, especially because it colonizes everyday life, such as language, ways of thinking, and even lifestyle. Thus, according to Shepherd-Hughes and Bourgois, violence can never be understood solely in terms of its physicality, force, assault, or the affliction of pain. Violence also includes assaults on the personhood, assaults on the dignity, sense of worth, or value of people. The social and cultural dimensions of violence are what give violence its power and its meaning. So again, and I'd love to speak to this at some length, but the incredible expert knowledge around violence, the many nuanced ways that women who have been incarcerated understand violence, far greater way of understanding it, far broader understanding than many of the much more narrow ones. So definitely they see violence as harmful, violence as painful, but they also see violence as playful, violence as retaliatory, violence that can do a whole range of different types of things, that violence is incredibly nuanced. Violence is fun. And we know that there's many legitimate forms of violence that are quite a lot of fun. called sport. It's really the way that really expert knowledge of the way that violence is understood. Manaia and Anarina, obviously I'm using pseudonyms here, are both whānau members of people who are currently incarcerated. Their own life stories have been shaped by structural violence. They both grew up in deprived areas, and most of their closest family members have been incarcerated at least once during their lives. In interviews, they both emphasise that jobs which guaranteed a minimum standard of living were largely unknown to their families, which, amongst other things, resulted in the systemic frustration of aspirations, Galton's definition of structural violence, for every child in their whānau. They learned very early that life was going to be difficult and necessitated an early adoption of a form of social realism of their material condition and likely life trajectory as a defence mechanism to the precarity of life. Many members of Manaia and Anarina's whānau have been active in gangs, and Anarina herself grew up in a street where new urbanised, Americanised style street gangs that were established in New Zealand during the 1990s. So not the large collective forms of gangs that we often are thinking of, but these much more local, often much more transitory forms. However, when a person sees, and she saw the prison and felt that anyone in their neighbourhood saw the prison as an unremarked and normal social institution. When a person sees a prison as something inevitable and unremarked, they come to internalise oppression or the historical trajectory of structural violence as something that is inside, that is individualised, rather than imposed from structural constraints of the settler colonial society. The person therefore lives and recreates societal dispositions and behaviours that were imposed upon them and sees them as something that is typically mine, in some cases as typically Māori. And you'll often actually hear that type of term being used. People will be talking about something that happened, something terrible that happened in a whānau, and they'll go, oh, Trace, just a typical whānau marriage. Typical Māori marriage. This internalised oppression where a person accepts the prison, forced identities, and other constructs such as patriarchy and the performance of hypermasculinity as normal or typically mine results in individualising incarceration where the ongoing dispossession with its structural violence remains removed from the public and policy-making discourse and often then removes itself from themselves. Tarina has been in and out of prison multiple times. She considers herself a career criminal. I make that point because the vast majority of women who are in prison are not career criminals. In fact, the vast majority of people who are in prison are not career criminals. Probably makes up less than 10% of prison populations, people who are career criminals who recognise that every day is about the earn. Very, very, very small part of a prison population. And she said, as a child, she experienced significant deprivation, and in order to survive, she actually had to steal food. She says, when I was growing up, I had nothing. We were poor. I didn't want that my children should live like that, and everything that I've done was to survive and provide for my children, which is really no excuse, but I did it, and I became good at it. Not that good. She's had 8 times in prison, but it's mainly, and she'll make that joke as well, she'll nearly always say it's not that good. But for her, that's the tax. That's the tax you pay. That the possibility of incarceration is the tax you'll pay. That sits within a very strong career criminal way of thinking. And she said, it's mainly surviving. I pretty much survived by myself since I was 10, actually younger. We had quite a nice upbringing as children until my parents divorced. My mum turned to alcohol and she was constantly drinking and never came home. We never had food, so we went out there to steal food. Me and my sister, she was 11, I was 9, and we were pretty much mothers at that stage. So for us to survive and feed our brothers and family, we'd go and steal. She actually has scars on her stomach from stealing hot rotisserie chickens, putting them under her clothes, and then having to run out of the store with them. She said she probably got those from 8 or 9 years old, of taking chickens in that way. How does one rise above? How does one escape a past that haunts and corrupts the future? Tarina's experience is very similar to the experience of other incarcerated Māori women. The neoliberal structure of dispossession deprived them from unconditional social security or welfare. often deprived them of the benefit of compulsory education, given that being excluded from school at an early age is a very shared characteristic of incarcerated Wāhine Māori, and opportunities to get a non-precarious job. The combined effects of the historical trauma, of the intergenerational impacts and the ongoing marginalisation meant that stealing food and other material goods became normalised and meant that she gained expertise and knowledge of the requirements of such activity. Those two of the women I was talking about became mothers in their very young, and selling or distributing drugs quickly became their main source of income. Or more correctly, the only way that they felt in the beginning to put food on the table, but they did recognise it later on. It became a part of the industry that they worked in and that they saw themselves within that industry. Tarina started to learn criminal codes and rules in order to climb a social ladder and provide her children with a lifestyle she never had. And she was able to definitely climb that particular social ladder during that period of her life. I'll just do this. Life on the margins, both existentially and ontologically, therefore requires us to think about people who are imprisoned, incarcerated sociologically, considering the historical trajectory of neo-colonial dispossession and ongoing forms of social vulnerability. The cycle of poverty and addictions not only signifies personal distress, it also critically strengthens the continuum of violence in households and in communities. Violence is also strongly present in women's prisons. Tarina observes that fights are usually connected to things someone wants, often very trivial things from cigarettes and drugs to phones and food, but also to very minor triggers, particularly around rumour. Our prison was quite violent. I used to be quite violent towards other people too. There was a lot of fighting in there, getting beaten up, stuff taken off them. Family would send in phone cards, people would stand over for them. Some people would even stand over for medication, shoes. If you have a nice pair of shoes on, people would beat you up and take your shoes. Some people even get paid to beat people up. Like some girls had made statements about some people and they would pay people to beat them up. I was a part of all of this. Very rarely a victim. I understood this system, I exploited this system, and I benefited from this system, if that is what you could call making a terrible system that harmed work for you. So she's very, very reflective on the way that she could work the system for the benefits that it gave her within the system. So women who have been incarcerated, family members, all assert the issue of intergenerational impact of imprisonment on Māori communities, what we call the tipping point, where it's not just about what your incarceration rate is, and remember we've got an incarceration rate, we've actually got, at the moment, the prison population is about 9.2, so it's gone down significantly. We don't know if that's connected to COVID and others, it probably is. We'll have to watch it over the next. So we have seen a significant reduction over the last 6 months. But really, the impact, the collateral damage is outside of the wire, not inside the wire. And that's the tipping point. If you've got a 217, 214 incarceration rate per 100,000, but when you disaggregate that, you've got an incarceration rate of 700 per 100,000 for Māori, then you can see what the tipping point is for communities, what it actually means to have those people removed from that community. Because the prison is a familiar and normal place in the community, it consequently becomes a critical part of these individual and collective identities. Very aware of time, so I am sort of moving through. Okay. The child learns that the norms and values and associated behaviours, because we've seen this really strong intergenerational element. At any one time within a women's prison, you're likely to have at least 2 generations there amongst certain groups. Much broader amongst first cousins. That's what I really noticed in terms of the younger groups. But I have known whānau that have had a daughter, a mother and a grandmother at the same time. So what does it mean for a child growing up with that, where the prison is an unremarked institution? The child learns the norms and values and associated behaviours that align with a stigmatised and prison identity. In other words, jail becomes identity, part of the culture, sometimes even referred to in whakapapa. With a carceral continuum that blurs the boundary between prison and a deprived area. People eventually accept both as individual parts of their lives. While prison is to be avoided and avoided practices are learnt, it also becomes part of one's life world, signifying the social space where they have to be strong and know how to act and behave in order to survive. With the imaginary transformation of an uncomfortable and violent carceral continuum into a comfortable social space where they understand rules and regulations of the field. I was drawing on a Bourdieuian analysis, where they know other people and have a respect among them. The hyper-incarceration becomes accommodated and internalized. By accommodating and internalizing the prison as something they can relate to, the prison itself becomes the central part of the identity. They belong to the prison, and the prison belongs to them. With other identities become subordinated to it, from belonging to certain iwi, whānau, or Māori as an ethnicity or as a cultural essence. The person intimately accepts the prison as something necessary and taken for granted, even if they resist it from within. Because of structural constraints of everyday life that continue to be reproduced by structural violence from institutions of the states to corporations and media, many Māori have to accept the rules of the game and get by in an environment of the violence continuum and a decreasing lack of hope. For example, Terina emphasises that when she first went to prison, she felt lost and scared, but as soon as she saw girls in the prison that she knew from the outside, she became more comfortable. And she quotes here, "Yes, I was quite scared at first, but when I got there, the girls made me feel comfortable. They welcomed me in there, and it soon became like a family-orientated environment. I felt quite comfortable, quite fast, so I adjusted to it quite well. The second, third, and fourth time I came in, I already felt like I was at home. It was my other home. So it was just like leaving my house outside to live in my house inside." Because she did not need to worry about providing food and paying the bills, Terina said it was even easier to get by in the prison than it was in the outside. What a social indictment that is. What a social indictment that the women who are in self-care units or the women who are in the baby and child units are in the best whare that they've ever lived in. Why would we have to give them houses like that on the inside when we can't do it on the outside? So here we can directly observe just one of those the consequences of real precarity. Violence was an everyday part of the prison, but she understood it as an inevitable part of poverty. And she said, "I used to rebel, I was quite impulsive, but in a prison environment, impulsive, disproportionate responses are quite rational. People leave you alone. They know you can't mess with you. They don't know what your response is going to be under a certain type of circumstances. You get quite a wide berth. So escalating things very quickly is actually quite a useful way. After a while, you don't have to do anything at all. It actually is a very useful way of resisting further victimisation. So in a woman's prison, reputation is everything, and to get by, you have to sense the game in order to gain respect. The same as in men's prisons, a female prisoner has to go beyond being comfortable to become accommodated within the dynamics of the prison, finding comfort in places of intense discomfort. Terina and many others have therefore often called their prison cell home their whare. People often talk about what they've got in their whare. To finish, I'm going to sort of talk about collective action and working the real possibilities around collective action. And here I'm drawing on some work I did with gang-related women, and here that's definitely their term, not gang-associated, not gang-affiliated, gang-related, because the kinship tie is what it is. Fathers, brothers, sons, grandfathers who are gang members, and what it means to grow up within that. And this was particularly some work that I was doing around E Tu Whānau, the initiative around, amongst other things, and looking at transformative action, particularly around whānau violence. So we were talking about how the initiative gave them ways of building on their already existent collective strengths as Wāhine Māori and ensuring te manakaha o te whānau. This was a group of people whose relationship with government agencies had been poor and who had an intimate understanding of the criminal justice system and with prison. Some had been incarcerated, but most had had whānau members who had been in prison. They had just come out of a protracted battle with Housing New Zealand where they had fought eviction and what they saw as the destruction of community. While it was acknowledged that the women who held the tenancy leases themselves were not seen as being involved in any criminal activity, in fact, the fact that they were associated with mongrel mob had ongoing connections meant that them and their tamariki were effectively criminalised. As they note, they were not gang associated, but they were gang related. The ongoing connections were with people who they had blood relationships with, often paternal and fraternal or intimate partner relationships. They went through a grueling legal battle that had both peaks and lows. Their relationship with agents of the state were based on a sense of mistrust and of betrayal. They felt that they and their children had been condemned by state authorities. While they had seen how they were able to work together in solidarity and had seen the power of the collective, they were also suffering ongoing hurt by the struggle and the outcomes of that struggle. So one of the things they first did when they came into the E Te Whānau collective was they created a manifesto. It's a fabulous document, this manifesto they created. It was sort of really around stopping the oppression of the masses, so it does remind one of other manifestos. So creating a manifesto allowed the women to give expression to Māori ways of being that empowered their own actions, particularly in the focus of their collective good. Growing up in gang whānau meant they had a strong sense of what that meant or an appreciation. They didn't have a strong sense of what it meant to be Māori. They knew they were Māori. But they didn't have an appreciation of things Māori. One of the women said that when her father had talked to her about the early days of mongrel mob, she realised that for him, as for many other Māori men, it was easier to be a gang member than it was to be Māori. For those men, their experiences of marginalisation, racism, and for many, the experience of state care had shaped who they were. And this had then impacted on their own development. Her father was already a patch member when she was born, and she had lived with mongrel mob all her life. She said that until E Te Whānau and her subsequent engagement with educational opportunities with Te Kora Waiaroha or Aotearoa, she had not ever used kia ora as a greeting. She was much more likely to use gang greetings, as she had done this since she was a child. She reflected on the role that education had played in her journey, and here I'm quoting her. At the wānanga, we were kept asking who we are, who had shaped us, made me think about the mongrel mob being my family. All these questions of who shaped you, who made you what you are today. I can say my mum and dad, but I had to be real to myself as I had lived with the mongrel mob my whole life. Every single day, in my house, every day. Just because they are known to others as bad, that is not the view I had, and I was sheltered from a lot of the bad stuff. So I'm going to say that mongrel mob shaped me. This is the truth. They are not just mongrel mob, they are your whānau, helping me be the person I am today. It was accepted that her particular experience of growing up in a mongrel mob whānau was special. Her father was a senior member of the mongrel mob and had protected the girls from a lot of what might be happening elsewhere in the broader gang collective and in the neighbourhood more generally. One of the women commented, "These were safe places for me, Auntie and Uncle's house, safe as. It was out in the greater community that I suffered the greatest violence. It was a contradiction for me that gangs were bad when I was safe in their house and not in others. I suffered all the violence I suffered outside of this immediate community." In the focus group, the issue of explicitly addressing violence came up rarely. Much of the focus was on creating the conditions of change that would allow whānau to flourish. However, it was accepted that violence, as a sufferer or as a perpetrator, had been experienced differentially amongst the group. Some had suffered violence, all had witnessed violence, and some had used and exercised violence. Though there had only been one man in the group, he noted that the young woman present had influenced his view on violence, and he was trying to keep his hands to himself. His discussion on violence spoke to man-on-man violence, which he saw as disciplinary, retaliatory, or defensive in nature. While he still felt there could be justification for certain types of violence, he said that he was far removed from the days when violence was his way in the world. What was noticeable in this exchange was how often the discussion was how open the discussion was and how the women felt comfortable giving their own views and offering dissenting views from his, even though they afforded him every respect. This was their way of walking the talk of e te whānau. One of the women said how working collectively had completely changed the way she thought about violence. She had suffered a lot of violence in her home as a child and as a young woman and an adult. She had also used a lot of violence against others. She felt real deep remorse for this, the hurt that she had done for others, but she also recognised the great gain she was making in living a life without violence. So to finish, a prison identity is neither an ascribed identity nor a natural identity conferred by descent. In many cases, it is an identity informed under conditions of resistance and of dissent. Dissent as opposed to dissent. Structural violence and the everyday exposure to the violence continuum creates the conditions where a prison identity emerges. Prisons hold a moral and symbolic role. They reflect the state of the world in which we live in. Prisons are architectures of control and one of the clearest expressions of state power. However, the violence continuum can be disrupted in the recognition that structural violence is made and can be unmade. Our societies are amenable to positive change. Radical honesty and radical action is necessary to ensure that we create a society where decarceration and prison abolition is not only possible, but it creates far greater collective security. So it's not just about opening those doors, but how do you create a just society? How do you create a society which has collective security? And this in turn opens the space for a transformational politics involving different actors, groups, communities to address the problems that have haunted us as a society. Kia ora tātou.